We are deaf. That is the true name of the book. That's how it starts off. It starts off, the first sentence is what names books from the old days. So it says, the apocalypse, the unveiling, which was presented to John by Jesus himself. And I'll reiterate that these are the last words within the book, are the last words ever spoken to the church directly by Jesus. Most people don't think about it that way. And they go, oh, I don't like that book. I want to read that book. So basically, they're telling me they don't want to hear what Jesus had, his last thing he had to say. They don't want to hear that. Whoa, hadn't thought about it that way. That's right. They hadn't thought about it. But yeah, so I mean, it's also showing us, I believe, the history of the church up to this point, and of course, what's happening in the future. So right today, we're in chapter 15. It's a short chapter. And chapter 15 is setting the stage for what we're going to have as our first lesson, chapter 16, when we come back July 14th. So middle of July, we're back in session. We're out for 2 weeks. So that's our biblical studies, class schedule. So today we're going to go further into well, before we go further into, I'm just going to reiterate something that I, in the past, have talked about. I just think this is pretty interesting. It's an outlier now, but as we get closer to the time, we're going to, I think, see a lot more of this. Not in our church, I don't think, but there are certain denominations that are so, how should I put it, less than alive, that are so, steeped in their traditions and in the way that they present things, that they are ripe for this type of artificial worship. So in Germany, and I was reading that several other churches over there have begun to adopt this. We have the artificial intelligence chat box, who's asking the believers in a fully packed St. Paul's Church in Bavarian town of Fürth. Of course, Bavaria is like a different area, but I guess we call it Germany now. It was one of Hitler's favorite spots. He liked Bavaria a lot. Say Bavarian town of Fürth, to rise from the pews and praise the Lord. Well, that sounds normal, right? Whoa, wait. The chat GBT chatbot, personified by an avatar of a bearded black man on a huge screen above the altar, then began preaching to the more than 300 people who had shown up on Friday morning for an experimental Lutheran church service, almost entirely generated by AI. So that is what is beginning to happen. Obviously, everything starts somewhere. They experiment, they see how it works. The Lutheran Church, although Luther started the Reformation trying to reform the Catholic Church abuses, initially he wasn't trying to start a new movement. Most all the Protestant movements none of them, as far as I can remember, were started in order to eliminate, the previous movement. They wanted to purify it or reform. That's why it's called reformation. So reformers, reformation. They're trying to reform and get rid of some of the abuses. But as they tried to do that, they got so much pushback that eventually they started their own, or it became, just by its own energy, became its own denomination. So that's where we get Lutheranism. That's where we got Methodism. Of course, Wesley was a Methodist, and he never wanted to leave the Anglican Church. Most people don't know that. And I actually went to his house in London and saw where he knelt every morning at 4 a.m. for a couple hours on these boards. And in the boards, I can't remember what they call the house, but it's, if you look up the Wesley House in London, you'll see where it is. But I tagged along with her. She was doing working for the state as motion picture representative, going to get different producers to bring movies to Florida. So I just tagged along, and so I went there, and among other places. And so in the board, there's like a closet with a board in it, a kneeling board, were 2 huge indentations where his knees came. That's how much he prayed. He made indentations in the wood. But and they had a suit of clothes that he wore and everything. He was by our standards today. I mean, he looked like he's about 5 foot. Hard to tell, but they were very smallish clothing. So he was quite a fellow. But anyway, all that's to say, he didn't want to start one. And the Anabaptist movement, who became the Baptist, who became Southern Baptist. They were against infant baptism in the Catholic Church. That was their thrust. So Anabaptism, or against baptism, meaning against child baptism. And then they just, I guess like we usually do, we shorten it down. We do that today, right? Just Baptist. So that's where we get Baptist from. And you might find it interesting that if you go into a Baptist church, and a lot of churches in Protestantism today, you'll find this balcony above and the platform in the front. You go, where'd that come from? The early church they didn't know about that. Peter, Paul, and John, they never saw anything like that. That wasn't how it happened. They were mimicking barns. They met in barns. And in the barns, you had a hayloft up front and the animals below. And so they would set up some kind of podium or a box, who knows what, right? I remember in Azusa Street, the Pentecostal revival, that William Seymour, an ex-slave he only had one eye, was probably one of the most powerful preachers of that time. He would put a bag over his head. He was so humble. He said, "I don't want anybody to look at me. I just want them to look at Jesus." And so this church was born out of that movement. You might say William Seymour is the founder of Assembly of Gods. So it's quite interesting. I had to study that seminary church history. But all that's to say that, all these things come from different places, and over time, they all start to degenerate. What should we say? Over time, the father's faith doesn't necessarily get passed down to the child's, and the child's to the grandchild. Over time, things get watered down and changed, and the people that follow later don't even understand why it was that way in the first place. Yeah. So men always degenerate things. Maybe that's a good way to put it. So over time, what started out like in the Baptists with the barns and all that, they built their first churches. They said, well, let's just build it like what we're in now. So they built a solid concrete barn, and they're called Baptist churches today. But our church is like that too, right? Going forward, you have about, we're kind of like a huge barn. Okay, so that's how that all happened. But that's to say that over time you end up. I remember that old story. The lady was cooking. I think it was a ham, where the lady was watching her grandmother, and her grandmother always cut off the ends of the ham. Well, she had this very modern big cooking device, and a pot, whatever you want to call it. And she got her ham, she cut it off the ends, and she put it in there. And I mean, she didn't even know why she was cutting the ends of the hams off. So she said to the grandma, why do we do that? Oh, honey, that's easy. When I was young, we were poor. We didn't have a pot big enough for the ham, so we cut the ends off. And now you're cutting the ends off because I did, but you have no idea why you're doing it. That's how people are. That's how we get to where we are. That's how denominations get to how they are. It's true. So, it's a matter of, like here, the Lutherans, unfortunately, although Luther was very strong, he kept a lot of the Catholic practices, some of them good, some of them not so good. But the thing is that, eventually he and his followers passed on his teaching, and they established the Lutheran Church. I'm just saying it's probably one of the more watered down type churches. It's not spirit-filled. I don't want to be too critical of them, but I'm just saying that you probably are not going to hear a lot of strong sermons. Although in World War II, one of the greatest preachers of World War II that Hitler executed days before Hitler killed himself was Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran pastor and probably the most outspoken pastor against Hitler and preacher. I mean, they still had some really good preachers, and they do today. But the thing is that, overall, I can see why the Lutheran Church today, wanting to attract people, wanting to be in the know, would try to adopt the latest technology. That's the way people are, right? We want to bring in more people, so we'll use technology. People love technology today. So what they have done is they're using an AI impersonator, if you will. You know, they chose a black preacher. They could have chosen anything. And it doesn't matter because the AI is making it, just making an artificial, they call it an avatar, right? Making a person out of bits, an electronic person. And that person will say whatever you want. And they've gotten really good at it. I mean, you just write they can, I could demonstrate it if I had to, but I won't. There are sites where you can just type in something and you can have a woman or a man or anything, and that person will say it flawlessly, like a newscaster. They just read it out. So that's what they're doing over there. And what's coming. In other words, the more watered down, I think, and the further away people get from solid biblical teaching, I think the more that's going to happen. So what is the big problem with that? What's the difference between a man delivering a sermon and a computer? Yeah, there's no Holy Spirit involved. How could it be the same? But if you're kind of a denomination where the Holy Spirit is minimized or negated, I shouldn't say negated, but I mean, in other words, kind of never talked about, put over to the side, then you're ripe for something like this. That's why I'm saying I don't think it would happen. Well, I shouldn't say it never happened, but it would I think happen to this denomination only probably after the rapture. There's too many Bible believing people and spirit filled people. So anyway, I just thought that's interesting to bring up because at this point, you know, when I put this on the screen last year, AI was like 6 months old. And now everywhere I look, everybody and their brother is AI. Go to buy something, they go, oh, including AI powered. It's everywhere. I'm just amazed in a year and a half since it released to the public that it's everywhere. Google has it, you know, Microsoft Bing has it, and there's, of course, ChatGPT itself, which is what was used here, the pioneer of it, which was started by Elon Musk. And then you have, you know, you have its ability now to generate images. So you can see how easy it is. It's generating images, it's generating movies, and that's all this was. So AI personage presenting the gospel is like a movie, right? And so it'll generate the script. You can go say, write a sermon, and here's the topic. So you don't need anybody at all. One person who tells it what to do, right? Write the sermon, create the avatar, and then you say, okay, I want them to be Chinese or whatever. And I want them to have this accent. You can make them anything you want to. And that's the great danger now, is because you can't. I used to say on the internet, you can't believe everything you read, but now it's getting to the point you can't believe everything you see. And there could be eventually there's going to be AI newscasters. I haven't looked it up. I'm sure it's already happening, I'm sure. And so then you're going to say, well, what that person is saying, I can't believe the live people. Imagine what's going to happen when you have an AI impersonator, an avatar who's telling you the news straight from the Communist Party or from whatever our government turns into. No political comments. I'm not saying nothing political here. Okay, anyway. Its own Bible, like it was going to rewrite the Bible. Yeah, so right, that's a good point. AI is rewriting the Bible. So we are entering into a time where it's projected by 2030, and I just keep on seeing the references to that over and over, that by 2030 we're going to have a singularity, an all-knowing AI. You say, how can that be? We're 2024. How in the world could that be? That's because that's how fast it's going. Because when you get into the world of software and bits, it's not like trying to build a railroad. You know, in the old days, well, the railroad came along, Queen Victoria rode a little train. It was a big deal and the world saw it. You know, and for, 50 years later, they finally had trains across the West. It was a very slow process. But when you're dealing with bits here and artificial intelligence, they're building huge farms, cloud farms. Our company's building huge cloud farms. They all are, especially Microsoft, and I forget how many billions they're going to spend on it. They're building them out in the desert, for one thing, because it's dry and doesn't affect electronics, but also they need huge amounts of power. So they need to have a power source, preferably nuclear power. That's another thing that I'm reading, and I will predict that nuclear power will become very popular again. Remember the green movement? No nukes. Nukes have to be everywhere because these things take as much power as a city. One farm, cloud farm for this AI takes as much power as a city. And they're already straining the grid. So, but they want it to happen because that's the future. And it's not that they want it to happen. I believe the demonic spirits who are energizing them, they're prepare ye the way. Prepare ye the way for the Antichrist. It's not that one day, this stuff is gradually going to be powered up until it gets to the zenith. At that point, that's when the tribulation will kick in. And so, can I say a date? I don't know. All I can say is by 2030, when I see all these things coming together, I call it the convergence, all these different streams of tech and science and everything else coming together, it's very possible that the Antichrist could come as early as that. It's no dates, setting no dates, but I'm saying that's how close we are. And it's like many things in the world, what's going on behind the scenes and what they're doing, the masses rarely know. Not until it's already done. When it's a done deal, then the masses find out. So that's that. Let's look at chapter 15. I just laid some general groundwork there. But the tribulation is divided into 7 years, 7 years in the midpoint. In other words, a point A, B, and C. And we're going to have 3 types of judgments. The apocalypse of the horsemen, those come first in the seals, and then you have the trumpets, the second, and then thirdly, you're going to have in chapter 16, our first session next semester, the bowls. They get progressively worse, or at least the first 2 sets are bad, but the last set here of 7 is really, really horrendous. And so we see that this is setting the stage in heaven for that event, that series of 7 to occur. Then I saw another great and marvelous sign in heaven, 7 angels with the 7 final plagues, with which the wrath of God is completed. So this talks about the wrath of God being completed. So when did the wrath of God start? In my estimation, the horsemen, the 4 horsemen, which is the first thing, it says it kills 1/4 of the Earth's population, all these 4 different plagues, right? The war, the sickness and disease, and just death by all kinds of modalities. So 8 billion now, 1/4 of 8 billion, 2 billion. I mean, 2 billion people die right off the bat. So I say that's when the wrath starts. Whether you call it wrath or not, I don't know what else to call it. It makes World War II look like a walk in the park. Okay, so is that the beginning of wrath? I only say it because you hear a lot of theories about this wrath and that wrath today. I never heard in 50 years of studying until recently somebody started making that stuff up, but I don't think that holds water. Yes, there is wrath mentioned, but the whole thing is wrath. And I mention that because in Revelation 3:10, talking to the good church, the church that has all the positives, it said that because you've been faithful, I will keep you from the hour of tribulation. An hour in Greek can mean, ora, can mean either, it could mean an hour, although they didn't have watches, right? They had sundials. So they did kind of know what an hour was, but that's not usually what it means. It usually, in this context, when it's kind of in a more general context, simply means the time. I will keep you from the time of the tribulation. So that's another reason why we know the church isn't here, because the church is not going to go through the time of tribulation. We're going to be kept from that hour. Revelation 3:10. I don't have it written here, but that's very important. And so these angels, it's a heavenly scene, and they are there with, of course, Jesus, God the Father, and they are coming forth with bowls. Each of the 7 has a bowl. King James says vial. It's a container for liquid, right? A bowl, a vial. We don't say vial too much today unless we're talking medical terms. I got a vial of blood, right? So, but that's not what it's talking. Bowl is a better translation. So I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire. Okay, so where do we see a sea of glass? Many weeks ago, we studied Revelation chapter 4 and 5, and that's where you see the scene in heaven. That's where you see the sea of glass. So clearly, if there's any doubt about where this is, it's the same place. It's a heavenly scene in the throne room of God. Beside which stood those who had conquered the beast and its image and the number of its name, they were holding harps from God. I think this is where you get cartoonists and others, depicting, I've always seen, you have the saints on clouds with little halos and harps, right? And so that's where people get the idea. All they're going to do is sit on a cloud and do this all day, But that's man's idea. That's not, obviously, it is in the scripture. It's not that it's unscriptural, but the context is a little bit different. So now we got a problem. They conquered the beast, but they're up there in the clouds with harps. So what is that? How could they have conquered the beast if they're up there? What happened? Well, how do we conquer them? How do we overcome? Another place the Revelation says overcome. They overcome, chapter 13, by the word of their testimony and the blood of the Lamb. That's how they conquered. So it's just two ways. Either they overcome, they conquered, the same thrust there. So it's not that they defeated the beast and he went out of the picture. They overcame him by their martyrdom, by their testimony. So that's why it's pictured this way. So this is, I believe, equal to or similar to Revelation 7, where you see the great multitude, and it says, "This, who are these people?" John says, and it says the reply was, this is the great multitude that came out of the tribulation. So we know who they are. A lot of times you have to correlate different chapters in Revelation. Keeping in mind, this is all one long letter. Okay, if you got it in the original, it was a huge scroll, and this is a little tidbit. The Greek was written all in capitals with no spaces. So if you ever see an ancient manuscript, you'll see just one character after another, no punctuation. There could be punctuation, only a couple, but mainly just one capital letter after the other. So you had to know Greek well enough to, I could do this today. I could just type you a text message and put no spaces in it. And I'd say pretty much certain every one of you would be able to read it. Only because you already know what the word should look like. That's how they did the Greek. They did it that way. But all that's to say that this is a huge letter, and all the parts were meant to be related together. There are different visions, subvisions, if you will, but it all fits together like a glove when you understand. You got to understand the whole thing to understand any part of it. So what we see is that this huge multitude is up there, and they sang the song of God's servant Moses and of the Lamb. And you go, I wish I knew what that song was. If only the book would tell me what that song was. Wait a minute, it's on the next part. Okay. Great and wonderful are your works. I'm being facetious a little bit, but I'm just saying a lot of it's like that. How can you understand Revelation? Because most of it is in the context explained to you. If not, it's at least a reference where you can go back to some other part of Revelation with that reference and understand it. O Lord God Almighty, just and true are your ways, O King of the nations. Okay, so he's about to pour out the worst judgment in the history of mankind, and they're saying, just and true are your ways, or we could say, just and true are your judgments. In other words, oh Lord, how could you do this? How could you throw these plagues on those poor innocent one world people? And it's like, they're re-emphasizing and praising and worshiping him at the same time, that he's the king of the nation. He's the one that rules the nations ultimately and will rule them soon on earth. And, that what he's doing here is absolutely fair and just. Oh, a loving God would never judge people. Well, they have not read this book. That's probably why they don't want to, a lot of people don't want to read this book. They just, oh, it's all symbolic, throw it on the side and don't read it. Because if you really read it, you can't believe that nonsense. Okay, who will not fear you, O Lord, and glorify your name? It's interesting that we read in chapter 6 that it says the great and mighty men, the sixth seal, the great and mighty men hid themselves in the rocks and the caves. They're all building underground bunkers. Every billionaire has an underground bunker somewhere. I mean, you read it just about every week. I read about it. But so, and when they're in these bunkers and they're being judged, they shake their fist at God and said, God, we stop this. We know you're doing this. Where's the atheists? There's no atheists in those bunkers. Yet they're not going to believe either. None of them, I see no evidence that any of them say, oh, I think I'll receive God now. No, they're in their bunker. They built it because they think they're smarter than God and can overcome anything. And we see that ultimately they will perish in their arrogance. All the nations will come and worship before you. The righteous acts have been revealed. In Zechariah 14, you don't have to go there, but it talks about after the final judgments and into the millennium that all the nations will go up to Jerusalem once a year at the Feast of Tabernacles to worship God. I believe that's what that's referring to. Okay, now we have the preparation for judgment, a little bit more information. Picture up there, partially covering it. The picture up there is an artist's depiction of 7 angels. Should be 7 with bowls, but hey, close enough. At least I found something. You guys, go out there and look for images. You're going to find some crazy stuff out there. So, every artist has his own idea. Of course, if they're believers, there's usually, this was from a believing site, so trying to depict as best they can. Verse 5, after this I looked in the temple, the tabernacle of the testimony was open in heaven. So, wait a minute, I thought the temple was on earth. No, the temple on earth is just a poor copy of the real temple in heaven. That's where the real temple. It's an archetype, they call it. An archetype is the real thing, the drawing, the master plan, and then what is built from that is the imitation of it. So, that's how we do a house, right? We have plans. The plan is the archetype, the master, and then the primary, I should say, the primary plan, the primary concept, and then you have the whatever you build. Which, in our particular case, as we watched our most recent house being built, believe me, that the scheme, the master, the primary drawing was not exactly what we ended up with. So yeah, if you've ever built a house, by the way, I would suggest finding one you really like and move in there. I don't know if any of you guys are builders. They got to work, but it's boy, it took us 14 months to get into that house. They said it would take 4 or 5 max. I don't even want to go into. All I could say is, I said at the time, I will never build another house. I'll find anything,
That's what I said as well.
You're smarter than I am.
Trust me, I went through the same thing you did. After I did it, I said I'll never do it again.
Well, unfortunately, today most people can't afford to build a house, let alone buy a house. So, but that's no political comment here. Okay, enough on that. And see, and out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues, dressed in clean, bright linen. Obviously, dazzling white, right? I remember the old Tide commercials. They would bring out the white. Look how white it is, Well, these guys are whiter than that, in the sense of, I think, reflecting the most light. So. By the way, just a physics thing, white reflects all colors, black absorbs all colors. So, it's a matter of how God designed light. So, and since heaven, I think, is all light, then it just makes sense that they would be in white, because then the tremendous light coming from the throne would bounce off them and make them appear super white, glow. Yeah, would glow. So. I think that's an interesting way to look at it. And they had girdled with golden sashes around their chests. Okay, I think the artist kind of got that right. So, what's the purpose? I guess just to hold the robes together. That's an ancient thing. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave the 7 angels 7 bowls full of the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. As I taught on at one point, I think it's chapter 4 and 5. I taught on the Zoane, as the scripture says. It's just these living creatures. It says creatures. Creatures is, I think, kind of a bad translation. They're not really creatures. They're in the Greek, it says the living. It's not even, it's a gerund. It's like running is a noun. I was running. Well, that's like a noun. It's not a verb. So this is, in the Greek, it says the living. Because they are so fantastical, they're so beyond words that you can't say, well, they embodied life and livingness. Everything about them is living. So they are the guardians of the Sometimes they're called cherubs. By the root word in Hebrew for cherub means guardian. That's all. So like in the Garden of Eden, there was angels and they call them cherubs. They weren't a different type of angel. That was their job assignment, not who they were. Who they were, angels. Their job assignment was guarding cherubs from the root cherub. So that's where that comes from. So as a guardian, these four, their main task is to be the guardians. They are the guardians of the throne. So that's why they're called cherubs sometimes. Most often, especially in the New Testament, they're called the Zoan. So they are the ones that gave the angels. So they get their orders. There's a hierarchy. God the Father is surrounded by the four living beings. And that's probably a better way to say it, living beings. And so God the Father gives those four who are the closest to him the bowls, and then the bowls are given to the angels. So there's a concentric circle almost, the throne circle, and then there's the cherubs, and then outside that are the angels. So God doesn't hand the bowls directly to the angels, because that's not the order of authority. He gives them to his superior guardians, who then give them, because no one's allowed to be to come into the throne. No one can come close to God directly. That's why he has the guardians. So I mean, I don't know that he needs guardians, but obviously he has created them for that purpose. And the temple was filled with smoke. Now I think this is referring to the Shekinah, as the Hebrew says, glory. And the Shekinah glory is what filled the temple. In the Old Testament, you would read that the kind of a fog came down. It's called the Shekinah glory. So the temple in heaven has the real thing, not the imitation. And from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the seven plagues of the seven angels were completed. Okay, so this shows, in other words, the fact that the temple is kind of shut down for business until these final seven bowl plagues are dealt out. So that shows us that how serious this is. So this is as serious as it gets. Okay, just a quick review. I think I did a little bit. We got 2,000 years since the cross. When we leave in the rapture, we're going to have 7-year tribulation. The midpoint, Antichrist is coming on the scene. Beginning, we're going to have the rapture. And earlier I gave, I don't know, a dozen proofs. And, there's people that believe differently, but I've looked at all of it and none of it makes sense to me. In other words, it doesn't fit the whole picture of prophecy. So it's like the wrath people, they're figuring on one word, wrath, and trying to take it out of context and give it a meaning that doesn't fit the overall process. We see that 144,000 are sealed in that 7 years, which is after we have gone. And then in the middle, you have the martyred souls. Antichrist comes, he says, worship me or die. And a lot of people are going to say die. And that's how they ended up in heaven on a cloud with a harp. And then at the end, after the 7 bowl judgments, you're going to have Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo, Parousia, which means that it's a visible coming of Christ, which most people think of as a second coming. And we're going to, after going through the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, that's when the 2 billion people will be eliminated. Then we're going to have in the middle, we're going to have the altar of souls. Satan is cast to heaven. I mentioned, I believe Satan is in some way going to inhabit the Antichrist personage, at the very least be in total possessing him completely. However, no one knows the mechanics. But the altar of souls occurs there that I mentioned when you have the many martyrs, because they happen in the middle. It's when he demands them worship him. That's when they're going to be killed. And the bowls, which we're going to study in the next lesson, 3 weeks. Is it 3? I guess it's 3 weeks, 2 weeks off. Then we're going to go further into the bowls, sores on the earth dwellers, sea turns to blood, fresh water becomes blood, sun goes nova, darkness covers the earth. And that's just the beginning of badness. And then the ones in red, that's game over. I should have put just game over, overlay game over between 6 and 7, because that's it. That's probably, both of those probably going to happen on the same day. It's going to be like bam, bam. Point C, I call it. And just to give us an overall, in case you get totally confused, which can be done, We have the beginning of the tribulation, the mid and the end when Christ comes back. Then 1,000 years, it's not to scale, 1,000 years of millennium where we will rule and reign with Christ. And then we're going to have the white throne judgment and the new Jerusalem, new heavens, new earth. And so we are going to end up in E. So we are going to be the E people. Okay, eventually. We see what we are now, we see what we're going to be during the millennium, but that's not our destination. Our destination is E City, is the New Jerusalem. And I've covered the different, of course, we're going to put this video and slides up there, but I've covered each of these chapters here. I presented them a little different relating to A, B, and C. At the beginning, the middle, and end of the tribulation, just so you can see what each of these particular chapters are. Some of them are more heavenly, some of them are more earthly. So the heavenly ones are above the line, and the more earthly ones in earthly time are below the line. And I'm here looking at all of the different chapters we're going to cover. So now, as we go into, we're finishing up on 15, and next semester we're going to go all the way from 16, 17, 18, 19, and we're going to go through all of this next semester and eventually going through 20, 21, and 22. So hopefully we'll cover all of that. It's quite a task. We'll see. If not, we'll have to go into another semester after that. So that's all to say that trying to give you where we've been, where we are today versus where we're going. So you have a what am I looking at? I guess so you have a scope, proper scope and dimension of what we're studying, because you can get lost if you don't have, it's like me when I was traveling in the old days and I had a triptych. And it was from AAA, and you had to flip it. And if you looked at just where you were, you couldn't see where you've been. In other words, you didn't have a whole map of your journey. You just had the little pieces, and you'd go, well, where was I 2 days ago? Well, unless you have to backtrack to try to figure out where you were. That's kind of like Revelation. You can have myopia and focus on one page of the triptych, but you always need to keep in mind where you've been and where you're going. Okay, enough said.